Some moments change everything. In the grand halls of Kensington Palace, where protocol dictates every breath and tradition weighs heavier than the crown jewels themselves, a single cry pierced through centuries of royal composure. It wasn't the cry of a king or queen demanding attention. It was something far more powerful and infinitely more human, the desperate wail of a small child who simply needed comfort. What happened next would shatter the invisible walls between duty and heart, between a uniformed guard and a future king. In those precious moments when tears flowed freely and a trained protector made a choice that would echo through his entire life, we discover that sometimes the most profound acts of loyalty aren't written in job descriptions or royal protocols. Sometimes they're born in the simple act of one human being reaching out to help another, regardless of bloodlines or birthrights. This is that story. A story where the weight of a crown meant nothing compared to the weight of a child's tears, and where a guard's decision to break protocol would forge a bond stronger than any oath of service he had ever sworn. The morning started like any other at Kensington Palace. Staff members moved through the corridors with practiced silence, their footsteps muffled against the ancient marble floors. Outside, London was waking up to another ordinary Tuesday in spring. But inside the palace walls, every day carried the weight of tradition and the careful choreography of royal life. Sergeant Marcus Thompson had been standing at his post for 3 hours when he first heard it. A small, muffled sound that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the private family quarters. As a member of the elite Royal Protection Squad, Marcus had trained for every possible scenario, from terrorist threats to medical emergencies. But nothing in his extensive preparation had quite prepared him for the sound of a crying child. The crying grew louder, more desperate. Marcus shifted slightly, his trained ears tracking the sound. It was coming from the family's private living room, a space he was meant to guard but never enter unless explicitly ordered. The rules were crystal clear. Maintain your position, observe and report, never interfere with family matters unless there was an immediate threat to safety. Prince George, then just 4 years old, had been having what his nanny diplomatically called a difficult morning. The little prince had woken up from a nightmare. Something about monsters hiding in the palace walls, and no amount of gentle coaxing from his usual caregivers could calm him down. His parents, Prince William and Kate, had been called away for an emergency meeting with palace officials about upcoming royal duties, leaving George in the capable hands of his trusted nanny, Maria Santos. But Maria was facing her own crisis that morning. Her elderly mother had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains, and despite her professional obligations, her mind was elsewhere. She had managed to dress George and get him through breakfast, but when the little prince started crying about his nightmare, her usual patience and gentle touch seemed to desert her. Marcus could hear Maria's voice through the heavy oak doors, speaking in soothing tones, but with an edge of frustration that hadn't been there during his previous assignments. He had been protecting the family for 2 years now, long enough to know the normal rhythms of their household. This wasn't normal. The crying intensified. It wasn't the ordinary fussing of a tired child, or even the dramatic wailing of a tantrum. This was the deep, soul-wrenching sob of genuine distress. Marcus felt his chest tighten with an unexpected emotion. He had nieces and nephews of his own, children he adored but rarely got to see due to the demanding nature of his work. The sound cut through his professional detachment like a knife through silk. Through his earpiece, Marcus could hear the routine chatter of other security personnel stationed throughout the palace. Everything was normal on their end. No threats, no unusual activity. Just another quiet morning in one of the most secure buildings in Britain. Yet here he stood, listening to a child's desperate cries and feeling more helpless than he had ever felt in his 15 years of military and security service. Maria's voice was rising now, still kind but with clear notes of desperation. "Please, Your Highness, you must stop crying. Your parents will be back soon. Please, sweetheart, tell me what you need." But George's response was only more tears, the kind of crying that seemed to feed on itself, growing stronger with each passing moment. Marcus found himself leaning slightly toward the door, every instinct screaming at him to help. He had seen combat zones, had faced armed criminals, had stood unmoved through protests and public disturbances, but the sound of a small child in distress was undoing him completely. The palace corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, its walls lined with portraits of long-dead royals who seemed to watch with stern disapproval. The weight of history pressed down on everything here, reminding everyone of their place in a hierarchy that stretched back centuries. Marcus was a commoner, a working-class man from Birmingham, who had earned his position through skill and dedication. He protected royalty, he didn't comfort them. His radio crackled softly. Thompson, status report. Marcus pressed the response button with a steady hand, though his heart was racing. All quiet on the East Wing, sir. It was technically true, but it felt like the biggest lie of his life. George's crying reached a new pitch, the sound of a child who had moved beyond the possibility of self-comfort. Through the door, Marcus could hear Maria speaking rapidly into her phone, presumably trying to reach the prince and princess. Her voice carried the panic of someone who was drowning in circumstances beyond her control. Marcus checked his watch. William and Kate had been in their meeting for 45 minutes. Royal meetings could go on for hours, especially when palace officials were involved. There was no telling when they might return. The crying continued, relentless and heartbreaking. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to center himself, to remember his training. His job was to protect, not to interfere. His job was to maintain professional boundaries, not to act on personal emotions. His job was to follow protocol, not to risk his career for the sake of one upset child. But as George's sobs echoed through the corridor, Marcus realized that some things mattered more than protocol. Some things mattered more than career security or professional boundaries. Some things mattered more than the invisible walls that separated the royal family from everyone else who served them. He had sworn an oath to protect the royal family. Did that protection extend only to physical threats? Or did it include protecting a small child from the kind of emotional distress that could leave lasting scars? Was he protecting Prince George by standing rigidly at his post while the boy sobbed his heart out just a few feet away, or was he failing in his most fundamental duty? The sound of Maria's increasingly frantic phone calls filtered through the door. She was calling everyone she could think of, other palace staff, backup nannies, anyone who might be able to help calm George down. But Marcus could tell from her tone that she wasn't having any luck. Everyone was either unavailable or too far away to help immediately. Marcus had grown up in a house where crying children were comforted immediately, where his own mother would drop whatever she was doing to hold him when nightmares made sleep impossible. His father had been a factory worker, his mother a school dinner lady, but they had never left him to cry alone. The idea was foreign to everything he had been raised to believe about caring for children. Yet here he stood, in one of the most privileged households in the world, listening to a small boy cry with a desperation that suggested he felt utterly alone. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. In his childhood home, with its hand-me-down furniture and constant financial worries, emotional comfort had been abundant and freely given. In this palace surrounded by priceless art and every material luxury imaginable, a little boy was crying as if his heart would break. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. George's crying showed no signs of stopping, and if anything, seemed to be getting worse. Maria's voice was becoming hoarse with exhaustion and stress. Marcus could hear her attempting various distraction techniques, offering toys, suggesting games, even trying to sing lullabies, but nothing was working. Marcus found himself thinking about his own nephew, Tommy, who was close to George's age. Tommy had night terrors too, and Marcus remembered holding him during a family visit, feeling the small body shake with fear, until gradually the warmth and security of being held by someone who cared helped the terror subside. It wasn't complicated psychology or advanced childcare techniques. It was simply the power of human comfort, freely given. His earpiece crackled again. All units, routine check. Any issues to report? Marcus's finger hesitated over the response button. He could report the situation, ask for guidance, pass the responsibility up the chain of command. It would be the safe thing to do, the professional thing to do. But it would also mean more delay, more bureaucracy, more time for George to suffer while adults worried about procedures and protocols. Negative control. All clear here. As soon as he said it, Marcus knew he had crossed a line. He was no longer just following orders and maintaining his post. He was making decisions, taking responsibility, choosing what mattered most in this moment. And what mattered most was the continued crying of a little boy who needed help that wasn't coming fast enough through official channels. The corridor seemed to stretch and compress around him as Marcus stood at the crossroads of duty and compassion, protocol and humanity. Every portrait on the wall seemed to stare down at him with judgment, reminding him of his place in the rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of palace life. But beneath all that weight of tradition and expectation, a child was crying, and every second of indecision felt like a betrayal of something far more fundamental than royal protocol. Maria's voice through the door was growing desperate now, pleading with George to tell her what he needed, what might help him feel better. But George was beyond words, lost in a storm of emotion that seemed to be consuming him entirely. The nightmare that had started his difficult morning had become real in the most visceral way possible. He was alone with his fear, surrounded by adults who cared but couldn't reach him. Marcus realized with a clarity that surprised him that this was the moment his life would pivot around, regardless of what he chose to do. He could maintain his post and let others handle the situation, preserving his career and his standing, but potentially failing the most vulnerable person he was meant to protect. Or he could step across an invisible line and face whatever consequences came from putting a child's immediate needs above institutional expectations. The choice, when it finally came, felt both inevitable and terrifying. The sound of George's desperate sobbing made the decision for him. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped away from his post. His hand moved to the ornate door handle with steady purpose, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. 15 years of military discipline warred with something deeper and more primal, the instinct to comfort a distressed child. The heavy door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a scene that stopped Marcus in his tracks. The family's private living room, usually a haven of calm elegance, looked like the aftermath of a small hurricane. Cushions were scattered across the Persian carpet, picture books lay open and abandoned, and in the center of it all sat Prince George, his small face red and streaked with tears. Maria Santos looked up from where she knelt beside the crying prince, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled from her morning of crisis management. Her dark hair had escaped its neat bun, and her eyes held the desperate look of someone who had exhausted every option in her considerable repertoire of childcare skills. "Sergeant Thompson," she whispered, her voice hoarse from trying to soothe George. "I'm sorry about the noise. I know you're not supposed to be disturbed. I've tried everything, but he won't tell me what's wrong. I've called for backup nannies, but everyone's busy this morning and his parents." Her voice trailed off as she gestured helplessly toward her phone, which showed several unanswered calls. Marcus took in the scene with the quick assessment skills that had served him well in his military career. This wasn't a tantrum or ordinary childhood upset. George was experiencing something deeper, genuine distress that had spiraled beyond his young ability to cope. The little prince sat with his arms wrapped around his knees, his whole body shaking with the force of his sobs. "May I approach, Your Highness?" Marcus asked quietly, directing his question to George rather than Maria. It was a breach of protocol even to speak directly to the royal child without being addressed first, but somehow it felt right to ask permission from the person who was hurting. George looked up through his tears, his blue eyes wide with surprise at seeing the tall guard in his family's private space. He hiccuped once, his crying momentarily interrupted by curiosity about this unexpected visitor. Marcus moved slowly, the way he had learned to approach frightened animals during his childhood on his grandfather's farm. He knelt down several feet away from George, making himself smaller and less intimidating, despite his impressive height and broad shoulders. "I heard you crying, and I was worried about you," Marcus said in the same gentle tone he used with his own nieces and nephews. "Sometimes when I was little, I used to have scary dreams too. Dreams about monsters and dark places." George's crying slowed to intermittent sniffles as he studied this new adult who had appeared in his sanctuary. Marcus wasn't like the other palace staff who always spoke to him with careful formality and distant respect. There was something warm and genuine in his voice, something that reminded George of his grandfather's easy manner during their private conversations. "The monsters were in the walls," George whispered, his first words since the crying had begun. "They were scratching and trying to get out." Marcus nodded seriously, treating George's fear with the gravity it deserved, rather than dismissing it as childhood imagination. That sounds really scary. When I was about your age, I thought there were monsters in my closet. They made noises at night, and I was sure they were going to come out and get me. What did you do? George asked, wiping his nose with the back of his small hand. Well, Marcus said, settling more comfortably on the carpet beside the scattered cushions, my dad taught me something special. He said that monsters are actually afraid of brave people, and that the best way to scare them away is to show them you're not afraid. But he also said it's okay to be scared sometimes as long as you don't let the fear take over everything else. Maria watched this interaction with growing amazement. In all her years of professional child care, she had never seen anyone connect with an upset child so quickly and naturally. Marcus wasn't using any special techniques or professional strategies. He was simply being genuine, speaking to George as one person to another rather than as a servant addressing royalty. But I am afraid, George admitted, his voice small and vulnerable. The scratching was so loud, and in my dream they broke through the wall and chased me through all the palace rooms, even the safe ones where Mummy and Daddy are. Marcus felt his chest tighten at the raw honesty in the child's voice. He recognized the kind of nightmare that wasn't just about imaginary monsters, but about the fundamental fear of being unsafe even in the places that should provide absolute security. You know what? Marcus said, glancing around the elegant room with its tall windows and solid walls. I think you picked the safest room in the whole palace to be in right now. And you know why? George shook his head, his attention completely focused on Marcus now. Because this is where your family spends their time when they want to feel happy and safe. Look around. There are pictures of people you love, books that make you laugh, toys that bring you joy. Monsters don't like rooms that are full of love and happiness. It makes them feel uncomfortable, so they stay away. As if to prove his point, Marcus gestured to a family photograph on the side table showing William, Kate, and George laughing together during a summer holiday. See, even in that picture you look brave and happy. The monsters can see that too, and it scares them. George followed Marcus's gaze to the photograph, and for the first time that morning, a tiny smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I remember that day. We were feeding ducks at the pond, and Daddy fell in trying to get my boat that got stuck. Exactly, Marcus said, encouraging this shift away from fear and toward happier memories. That's the kind of person you are. Someone who has fun adventures and happy times with people who love you. Monsters don't know what to do with children like that. Maria watched this transformation with professional fascination and personal relief. George's breathing had returned to normal. His tears had stopped and color was returning to his previously pale cheeks. More importantly, he was engaging with the world around him again instead of being trapped inside his fear. But what if they come back tonight? George asked, the worry creeping back into his voice. Marcus considered this seriously. He could offer empty reassurances that monsters weren't real, but he sensed that George needed something more substantial to hold on to. Well, he said thoughtfully, I'll be here, standing right outside your door like always. And you know what my job is? To keep bad people away? That's part of it, but my real job is to make sure you and your family are safe and protected. That includes protecting you from anything that might try to hurt you or scare you, even in dreams. So if any monsters do try to come through the walls, they'll have to get past me first. George studied Marcus's face with the serious attention that children reserve for adults they're deciding whether to trust. He took in the kind eyes, the patient expression, the way this big, strong man had made himself small and approachable just to have a conversation on his level. Are you very strong? George asked. Strong enough to handle any monsters that might bother you, Marcus replied with quiet confidence. But you know what makes me even stronger? What? Knowing that I'm protecting someone as brave as you. Because even though you were scared, you told me about your nightmare instead of keeping it secret. That takes courage. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor outside. Prince William's voice could be heard speaking urgently to someone, probably getting an update on the situation from other security personnel. The emergency meeting had apparently ended, and word had reached him about George's difficult morning. Marcus felt a moment of panic. He was still kneeling on the carpet in the family's private living room, having abandoned his post and broken numerous protocols to comfort a crying child. This career could end in the next few minutes. regardless of how successful his intervention had been. But as he looked at George, who was now sitting up straight and seemed more like his usual bright, curious self, Marcus realized he felt no regret about his decision. Some things mattered more than following rules, and the well-being of a child was certainly one of them. "Your father's coming," Marcus said quietly to George, starting to rise from his position on the floor. "Will you tell him about the monsters?" George asked, a hint of worry returning to his voice. "I'll tell him that you had a scary dream, but that you were very brave and talked about it instead of keeping it inside. And I'll tell him that you're okay now." The door burst open as Prince William entered the room, his face tight with concern and the stress of having been pulled from important business to deal with a family crisis. He took in the scene quickly, Maria looking exhausted but relieved, Marcus rising from the floor beside George, and his son sitting calmly among the scattered cushions with no signs of the distress that had been reported to him. "George, are you all right?" William asked, crossing the room in quick strides to kneel beside his son. His eyes flicked to Marcus with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been gratitude. "I'm better now, Daddy," George said, leaning into his father's embrace. "I had a nightmare about monsters in the walls, but Sergeant Thompson told me they're afraid of brave people and rooms full of love. And he said he'll make sure they don't bother me tonight because that's part of his job." William looked up at Marcus over George's head, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, loaded with the weight of protocol violations and the undeniable fact that whatever Marcus had done, it had worked when other approaches had failed. Marcus straightened to attention, prepared to face whatever consequences awaited him. He had made his choice and helped a distressed child, and he would accept responsibility for both the breach of protocol and the positive outcome that had resulted. Prince William stood slowly, his hand resting protectively on George's shoulder as he studied Marcus with an intensity that made the experienced security officer feel more nervous than he had during any hostile interrogation. The silence in the room stretched taut as a violin string, broken only by George's quiet breathing and the distant sounds of palace life continuing beyond these walls. "Maria, would you mind taking George to the kitchen for some lunch?" William asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Cook mentioned something about making those biscuits he likes." George looked between his father and Marcus with the intuitive awareness that children possess for adult tensions. "Is Sergeant Thompson in trouble because he helped me?" "No, sweetheart," William said, though his eyes never left Marcus's face. "I just need to have a conversation with him. You go with Maria and enjoy your biscuits." Maria gathered herself quickly, relief evident in her posture now that the immediate crisis had passed. She guided George toward the door, but the little prince stopped and turned back to Marcus. "Thank you for making the monsters go away," he said with the solemn sincerity that only children can muster. "Will you still be here when I come back?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus felt the weight of uncertainty about his immediate future. "I'll do my best, Your Highness." George seemed satisfied with this answer and allowed Maria to lead him from the room, chattering about what kind of biscuits he hoped Cook had prepared. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. William moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out at the carefully manicured palace gardens. Marcus remained at attention, waiting for what felt like an inevitable reprimand, and quite possibly the end of his career in royal protection. "Sergeant Thompson," William began without turning around, "in your time with our family, how many protocols would you say you've broken?" The question caught Marcus off guard. He had expected anger, demands for explanations, immediate dismissal. He hadn't expected what sounded almost like curiosity. "Until today, sir, none that I'm aware of." "And today?" Marcus took a deep breath, choosing honesty over any attempt to minimize his actions. "Several, sir. I left my assigned post without authorization. I entered family quarters without permission. I interacted with Prince George without being addressed first. I made decisions about family welfare that were outside my authority." William nodded slowly, still facing the window. "You could have radioed for guidance. You could have waited for backup. You could have maintained your position and let others handle the situation." "Yes, sir, I could have." "Why didn't you?" The simple question demanded a complex answer, and Marcus found himself reaching for words to explain something that had felt purely instinctual in the moment. Because Prince George needed help immediately, and I was the person best positioned to provide it, sir.
Everything else seemed secondary to that need. William turned from the window, and Marcus was surprised to see not anger in his expression, but something that looked remarkably like approval mixed with deep thoughtfulness. "Tell me about your background, Sergeant."
"Not your service record. I've read that. Tell me about your family." The unexpected direction of the conversation left Marcus uncertain about how to respond, but William's tone suggested genuine interest rather than a trap. "I grew up in Birmingham, sir. Working-class family. My father worked in manufacturing, my mother in school services, 3 younger siblings. We didn't have much in terms of material wealth, but my parents prioritized family time and emotional support." "Children in your family?" "Nieces and nephews, sir. I'm not married, but I spend time with my siblings' children when my schedule permits." William nodded, moving to sit in one of the comfortable armchairs that faced the fireplace. He gestured for Marcus to sit as well, another break from normal protocol that left the security officer feeling increasingly off balance. "What you did today," William said once they were both seated, "was exactly what I would have wanted someone to do for my son if Kate and I couldn't be there ourselves. You saw a child in distress, and you responded with compassion and practical wisdom." Marcus felt relief flood through him, followed immediately by confusion. "Sir, I understand that I violated several important protocols." "You did," William agreed, "and we'll need to address that. But you also demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and character that I want surrounding my family. You put George's immediate well-being above bureaucratic procedures, and you did it with skill and sensitivity." The prince leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Of course, sir. When you heard George crying, what was your first instinct?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "To help him, sir. Everything else, the protocols, the potential consequences, came second to that immediate need to stop his distress." "And that didn't concern you? The risk to your career?" "It did concern me, sir, but it concerned me less than the idea of leaving him to suffer when I might be able to help." William sat back in his chair, studying Marcus with the same careful attention he brought to important state decisions. The silence stretched between them, but it felt different now, contemplative rather than tense. "I need to tell you something about royal protection that perhaps wasn't emphasized enough in your training," William said finally. "The greatest threats to my family aren't always external. Sometimes they're internal. The isolation that comes with royal life, the emotional distance that protocol can create, the way that excessive formality can make my children feel like specimens rather than people." Marcus listened intently, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere significant. "George will grow up in a world where most adults will treat him differently because of his birth. They'll be more formal, more distant, more concerned with saying and doing the right thing than with seeing and responding to who he actually is as a person. That's necessary to some degree. The institution of monarchy requires certain boundaries, but it's also dangerous if it becomes the only way he experiences adult relationships." William stood and moved back to the window, his gaze distant. "What you gave my son today wasn't just comfort during a difficult moment. You gave him the experience of being seen and helped by an adult who responded to his humanity rather than his title. That's invaluable, and it's something I want him to experience more often, not less." The implications of what William was saying began to dawn on Marcus. This conversation wasn't heading toward dismissal or reprimand. It was heading somewhere entirely different. "I'm going to make some changes to your assignment," William continued. "With your permission, I'd like to expand your role beyond traditional security duties. You would still be responsible for physical protection, but I'd also like you to be available for situations like today, times when George or his siblings need adult support and their parents aren't immediately available." Marcus felt his world shift around him. "Sir, I'm honored by your confidence, but I'm not trained in childcare or child psychology." "No, but you're trained in reading situations and responding appropriately. You have natural instincts for working with children, and most importantly, you've demonstrated that you'll put their well-being above everything else when it matters." William turned back to face Marcus, his expression serious but warm. I need people around my family who I trust to make good decisions in unexpected situations. People who see my children as children first and royal obligations second. Today, you proved that you're exactly that kind of person. The offer was everything Marcus had never dared to dream about. Increased responsibility, greater trust, a chance to make a real difference in the lives of people he had come to care about deeply. But it also carried weight that both excited and terrified him. What about the protocol violations? Marcus asked. We'll address those through proper channels. There will be meetings, revised procedures, updated training protocols. But the outcome will be expanded authority for you to act on your judgment in situations involving the children's welfare. What you did today will become part of your official duties rather than a violation of them.
William smiled for the first time since entering the room.
Besides, I suspect that George is going to specifically request your presence when he's having difficult days. Children have excellent instincts about which adults they can trust, and he's clearly decided that you're one of them. As if summoned by their conversation, the door opened and George appeared, his face bright with excitement and chocolate smudged around his mouth from the promised biscuits. Daddy, may I show Sergeant Thompson my new book? It has pictures of castles with real knights who protected princes. William looked at Marcus with raised eyebrows, amusement clear in his expression. I think that would be wonderful, George, and I think Sergeant Thompson would very much like to hear about knights who protected princes. As George launched into an enthusiastic description of his book, climbing onto Marcus's lap with the easy trust of a child who had found a new ally, Marcus realized that his life had just taken a turn he could never have anticipated. The weight of greater responsibility settled on his shoulders, but it felt right in a way that simple security duties never had. He was no longer just protecting bodies and maintaining perimeters. He was protecting the emotional well-being and humanity of children who would one day carry the weight of a nation. It was a privilege that felt both humbling and inspiring, and it had all started with the simple decision to respond to the sound of a crying child. 6 months after the morning that changed everything, Marcus Thompson found himself in a position he could never have imagined when he first donned his Royal Protection Squad uniform. He stood in the palace gardens on a crisp autumn morning, watching Prince George demonstrate his improved football skills with the determined focus of a 5-year-old who had discovered something he truly loved. Watch this one, Marcus, George called out, using the informal address that had become natural between them. He lined up the small football and kicked it with all his might toward the makeshift goal they had set up between 2 rose bushes. The ball sailed wide, landing in a flower bed with a soft thud that sent a small shower of petals into the air. George's shoulders slumped with disappointment, but he quickly brightened when Marcus jogged over to retrieve the ball. Good power behind that kick, Marcus said, examining the ball before tossing it back. What do you think happened with the direction? George considered this seriously, a habit he had developed during their time together. Marcus never dismissed his efforts or offered empty praise, but instead encouraged him to think through problems and find solutions. I think I was looking at the goal but not really aiming, George said after a moment. Like when I tried to throw my paper airplane at the window but was looking at the curtains instead. Exactly right, Marcus confirmed, impressed as always by the boy's ability to make connections between different experiences. Want to try again with more focus on where you want the ball to go? As George set up for another attempt, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his role had evolved. The official changes to his assignment had been processed through proper channels, complete with additional training and revised protocols. He now held the unique position of personal protection and family liaison officer, a role created specifically to address the needs that had been revealed during that difficult morning in spring. The expanded responsibilities had required him to study child development, basic psychology, and family dynamics. He had undergone additional background checks and completed specialized training in recognizing and responding to childhood trauma and stress. But the most valuable education had come from daily interactions with George and his siblings, learning to read their moods, understand their fears, and respond to their individual needs. George's second kick was much more successful, sending the ball sailing cleanly between the rose bushes. He jumped up and down with excitement, his joy infectious and complete. Did you see that? It went exactly where I wanted it to go. I saw it. Marcus said, sharing in the celebration. That's what happens when you combine good technique with clear focus. Your father will be impressed when he gets back from his meetings. The mention of Prince William brought a slight shadow across George's expression. The demands of royal duty had increased significantly in recent months, meaning longer meetings, more official engagements, and less time for the simple family moments that George treasured. Marcus had learned to recognize these subtle shifts in mood and respond to them before they could develop into larger problems. It was a skill that had proven invaluable not just with George, but with Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis as well, each of whom had their own unique personalities and needs. "Marcus," George said, settling onto the grass beside their makeshift goal, "do you think Daddy likes being a prince?" The question caught Marcus off guard with its complexity and insight. At 5 years old, George was beginning to understand that his father's role came with obligations that sometimes conflicted with what he might personally prefer to do. Marcus sat down beside him, giving the question the serious consideration it deserved. "I think your father loves his family more than anything in the world, and he loves being able to help people through his royal duties. But I also think sometimes he wishes he could spend more time playing football in the garden and reading bedtime stories. Like how I love learning about knights and castles, but sometimes I wish I could just play video games all day." "Very much like that," Marcus agreed, continually amazed by George's ability to understand complex emotions and situations. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the autumn leaves drift down from the ancient oak trees that had stood in these gardens for centuries. Marcus had learned that some of their most important conversations happened during these quiet interludes, when George felt safe to share his deeper thoughts and feelings. "Marcus," George said eventually, "when I'm king someday, will you still be my friend?" The question hit Marcus with unexpected emotional force. In their daily interactions, it was easy to forget about the ultimate destiny that awaited this bright, curious, sometimes anxious little boy. George would indeed become king one day, with all the weight and responsibility that role entailed. "I hope so," Marcus said honestly. "But even if I'm not able to be around when you're king, I'll always care about you and want good things for your life. That doesn't change based on titles or jobs." George considered this with the thoughtful expression that had become familiar to everyone who spent time with him. "Will you help me remember how to be normal? When I have to do king things, I mean. Will you help me remember about playing football and reading books and laughing at silly jokes?" The request revealed a wisdom and self-awareness that seemed far beyond George's years. He was already beginning to understand the tension between his public role and his private self, and he was actively seeking ways to maintain balance between the two. "I think that's one of the most important things any king could remember," Marcus said. "And yes, if you want my help with that, I'll do whatever I can." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Princess Charlotte, who ran across the garden with the determined stride of a 3-year-old on a mission. She had recently discovered that she could join in some of George's activities, and she approached every new experience with fearless enthusiasm. "George, Marcus, I want to kick the football too," she announced, her cheeks flushed from running and her hair escaping from its carefully arranged style. Marcus and George exchanged glances, both thinking about Charlotte's tendency to kick with more enthusiasm than accuracy. The flower beds had already suffered enough damage for one day. "How about we move to the bigger lawn?" Marcus suggested diplomatically. "That way we can all practice together without worrying about the roses." As they gathered their makeshift equipment and headed toward the open lawn area, Marcus reflected on how these simple moments had become the foundation of something much larger than his original job description. He wasn't just protecting the royal children from external threats anymore. He was helping them develop the emotional resilience and self-awareness they would need to navigate the unique challenges of their births. Each child required a different approach. George needed patient conversation and gentle encouragement to work through his worries and fears. Charlotte thrived on active engagement and clear boundaries combined with plenty of opportunity for adventure. Prince Louis, still a toddler, mostly needed consistent presence and the kind of warm, uncomplicated affection that helped him feel secure in his rapidly expanding world. The work was demanding in ways that traditional security duties had never been. It required constant attention to emotional undercurrents, careful navigation of family dynamics, and the ability to maintain appropriate boundaries while still providing genuine care and support. But it was also the most rewarding work Marcus had ever done. As they reached the lawn and began setting up for an impromptu family football match, Prince William and Catherine appeared on the garden path, having finished their morning meetings earlier than expected. The sight of their children playing freely with Marcus, all of them laughing and relaxed, brought immediate smiles to their faces. "Room for 2 more players?" William called out as they approached. "Daddy!" George ran toward his father with unrestrained joy. "Marcus taught me how to aim properly, and I scored 3 goals already." "Only 2 were actually goals," Charlotte corrected with the brutal honesty of a younger sibling. "The other one hit the fountain." Catherine laughed as she hugged Charlotte, then looked over at Marcus with the expression of gratitude that had become common between them. The changes in their children's confidence and emotional stability since his role had expanded were visible to everyone in the family. "Marcus, thank you for keeping them active and happy," she said. We could hear the laughter from the office windows. "It's my pleasure, Your Royal Highness. They make the job easy." As they organized into teams for their informal game, Marcus found himself thinking about the morning 6 months ago when everything had changed. Prince George's tears had led to a moment of decision that had transformed not just Marcus's career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. The little boy who had cried about monsters in the walls was now confidently suggesting game strategies and encouraging his sister's efforts. The bond that had formed in that moment of crisis had grown into something deeper and more complex, a relationship that honored both Marcus's professional responsibilities and his genuine care for the family he served. As the game began and laughter filled the garden air, Marcus understood that loyalty wasn't just about following orders or maintaining protocols. True loyalty meant seeing the whole person, not just the title, and responding to human needs with wisdom, compassion, and courage. The monsters in the walls had been real, in their way, fears and anxieties that could have grown into larger problems if left unaddressed. But they had been defeated not by force or protocol, but by the simple act of one person choosing to respond with kindness when kindness was needed most. George scored another goal and turned to Marcus with a grin of pure triumph, and Marcus realized that some bonds, once forged in moments of genuine human connection, become unbreakable. Protocol and tradition had their place, but nothing would ever be more important than the trust of a child who had learned that adults could be counted on to help when help was needed. The game continued as the autumn sun climbed higher in the palace gardens, and Marcus stood guard not just over bodies and boundaries, but over the precious normalcy that would help these royal children grow into healthy, grounded adults. It was a responsibility he had never trained for, but one he wouldn't trade for anything in the world.